You do not see the United States saying that this act was a violation of international law. You do not see the UK making such a statement. In fact, there was an attempt to bring this up in the Security Council, but it failed. Pakistan, despite being a current member of the Security Council, was unable to bring this topic onto the Council's agenda, only because we had acted proportionately. But in response to that, what Pakistan did, as rightly pointed out, was to attack civilians. They attacked our civilians along the LOC. They started bombing houses, schools, religious places, and clearly the attack was disproportionate. And in addition to that, Pakistan decided to escalate the entire issue by actually attacking military installations in India. We made very precise strikes against in 9 locations, as Captain Bansal pointed out, and that was the focus that we had. We ensured that there was limited damage, and the damage was to actual terrorists. And therefore, India acted in a manner consistent with international law, consistent with the UN Charter, and invoking its right to self-defense. Thank you. I thank the Adhivakta Parishad for the invitation to speak here with this august audience. And to hear Captain Bansal was a delight to all the facts that came out. I will try to focus more on the international law perspective of these issues. He has, of course, given us the background and with a lot of factual data, relevant data. In fact, I learned a lot from listening to what he had to say about incidents that occurred even prior to Operation Sindoor, prior to the decision to actually put the treaty in abeyance. Now, my focus will be on both the Operation Sindoor itself, as well as the decision of the Government of India to renegotiate the Indus Water Treaty, as well as the decision ultimately now to put the treaty in abeyance. So let me start with how I see Operation Sindoor from the perspective of international law. The Government of India, if we see on May 7th, was very particular in the language that it used. And this is very significant, that in the Press Information Bureau release, as well as the statements made by the Government of India, they focused on the fact that the attack in Operation Sindoor that occurred was limited, it was non-escalative, and was proportionate. All of these had significance under international humanitarian law, as well as from the UN Security Council resolutions that were passed just post 9/11. Now, what happened after 9/11 was that the United Security Council passed 2 resolutions. And in fact, this is something that many of the commentators have missed, that India has consistently been relying on these Security Council resolutions, even while they previously did the Uri attack that happened in 2019, and even prior to that. So if you see for the past 10 years, Government of India has laid the framework to what happened today in Operation Sindoor. They have consistently held that we are exercising our right to self-defense. And this is clearly linked to the decision of the Government of India to actually say that any further terrorist attack will be dealt with as an act of war. Again, this terminology of act of war is not simply being used for political purposes. By declaring it to be an act of war, we are invoking the principles of self-defense again. And this was the same principle that the United States invoked, surprisingly, and they limited it to this, and it shows that now there is consistent state practice, with the Republic of India also adopting the fact that non-state actors like terrorists who are not being acted against by a sovereign state, then that act will be considered an act of war. And when you consider it to be an act of war, it opens up your rights under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which allows you a right to self-defense. But that right to self-defense is, of course, limited, because you cannot use that to, unlike the US perhaps, we have not actually gone ahead and attacked civilians. We have not actually gone ahead and taken decisions to have a full-fledged war. We made very precise strikes in 9 locations, as Captain Bansal pointed out, and that was the focus that we had. We ensured that there was limited damage, and the damage was to actual terrorists. And therefore, India acted in a manner consistent with international law, consistent with the UN Charter, and invoking its right to self-defense. And if you see the aftermath of that, there was no major condonation or condemnation by any major nation. You do not see the United States saying that this act was a violation of international law. You do not see the UK making such a statement. In fact, there was an attempt to bring this up in the Security Council, but it failed. Pakistan, despite being a current member of the Security Council, was unable to bring this topic onto the Council's agenda, only because we had acted proportionately. But in response to that, what Pakistan did, as rightly pointed out, was to attack civilians. They attacked our civilians along the LOC. They started bombing houses, schools, religious places, and clearly the attack was disproportionate. And in addition to that, Pakistan decided to escalate the entire issue by actually attacking military installations in India. Now, that decision led to a further round of attacks from India as well, naturally, again, because it was a right to self-defense. Pakistan clearly tries to argue, if you see the statements made by their ministers, if you see the statements made in the media, they're clearly trying to argue again that they're in fact invoking Article 51 of the United Nations Charter by invoking a right to self-defense. But that does not appear to be proportionate. Even if they had invoked, let us suppose hypothetically that as they claim, India had acted as an aggressor, clearly their actions were disproportionate. Their actions were targeting civilians and also targeted military installations in India. Of course, they failed. Major attacks that they tried has completely failed, despite the propaganda of the Pakistani media. So therefore, we see that this led to the escalation, and India has consistently respected international law. Being a respected member of the Committee of Nations, India has in fact taken actions which were precise and in consonance with the United Nations Charter as well as the United Nations Security Council decisions. Now, coming to the Indus Waters Treaty, if we look at the Indus Waters Treaty, this was a treaty that was entered into in 1960. And if you look at the background behind the treaty, in fact, there was 5 long years of negotiation. It was not that the treaty was negotiated in a year. It was a bitter negotiation that happened. And if you look at the Lok Sabha debates that occurred during the 1960, because this was one of the few treaties that the government of India then decided to actually bring and table in the parliament. So if you look at, unlike say the United States, where it is mandatory for ratification of treaties to actually take the treaty to the Congress, you do not have this mechanism in India. The President of India is competent to ratify treaties. However, wherever there are important treaties, this is being one example, and say, for example, the World Trade Organization treaty that was entered into, even at that time, a decision was taken to actually bring it to Parliament. A discussion happened in Parliament, and it wasn't that everyone was happy with the treaty. In fact, the existing ruling party members of Parliament in 1960 pointed out many lacunas in the treaty. They said this treaty is actually imbalanced. It may appear to be balanced, no doubt there was a need for a treaty perhaps, because clearly, if you look at history, it clearly shows that India and Pakistan do not have the best of relations. And the treaty helped in ensuring that as far as the flow of waters are concerned, they are not impacted by the kind of political situation that both the countries are in. But despite that, we can see that there were certain requirements on India. India, in fact, paid a very large amount under the treaty. This is not spoken of in the recent past because much of that was paid in the first 10 years of the treaty. And India even made payments about approximately 50 to 60 crores INR then. In 1965, even when Pakistan as an aggressor had started the war. So even in 1965, we were bound to make payments for the construction of canals in Pakistan. This was part of the agreement. We were paying them. And when this issue was also brought out in the Lok Sabha in 1965, the then minister, Mr. K.L. Rao, he made a statement in in the Lok Sabha. And I bring this up because of the recent statements made by the World Bank president. The minister then said that this is a tripartite agreement. According to the minister, and which now appears to be a false statement, he actually said that this is an agreement between India, Pakistan, and the World Bank. But if you see the recent statement made by the World Bank president last week, he clearly stated that we have nothing to do with the actual workings of the treaty. We are merely a facilitator. They had a certain role in terms of actually acting as the fund manager by getting all the money from India and making sure that the fund was properly being utilized by Pakistan, perhaps not for other purposes, and to ensure that they're using it only for construction on the river waters. And beyond that, they had the role of actually appointing the neutral expert and the court of arbitration. So the World Bank itself did not consider this to be a tripartite agreement. It is a bilateral treaty. But the government in 1965 told the parliament that this is a tripartite agreement. If we break this treaty, even during war, it will lead to India being termed as an aggressor, being viewed as violating international law, which was not true. So if you see, at that point, India failed to actually take advantage of its position, to actually understand the intricacies of the treaty itself. Unlike today, where we see now we are actually examining the treaty and viewing and examining it in the whole public international view, public international law perspective. You cannot look at the treaty only as a document, which is what Pakistan is arguing right now. They are making silly arguments, if you see. I must term this silly arguments, because ministers of that government are actually saying that you cannot suspend the treaty. You cannot terminate the treaty. This is ignoring public international law. All of us are lawyers, most of us are lawyers here, and we understand that no treaty can actually exist in a vacuum. The treaty exists in the sphere of law and must be interpreted as per the general principles of law, must be interpreted as per public international law. And clearly, international law says where the treaty is silent on termination of a treaty, then customary international law will apply. And what does customary international law tell us? And here I would also like to talk about the Vienna Convention of Law of Treaties briefly. I'll try to end this quickly because I appreciate the sentiment that we feel this is a topic which is current and there can be a lot of discussion. But if you see the Vienna Convention of Law of Treaty, it clearly provides in the preamble as well as Article 4 of the treaty that it applies only to treaties entered into post the enforcement of the VCLT. And the VCLT came into force only in the 1980. So a treaty like the Indus Waters Treaty is not governed by VCLT, let alone, now let us ignore the fact that India is not a party to the VCLT at all. But even then, the treaty doesn't apply. It prohibits retroactive application. But Pakistan argues we have violated VCLT. They argue that they will go to the ICJ or to other bodies to actually pursue that, which is clearly non-serious. They're not looking at this issue seriously at all. They're making rhetorical statements to convince their public that they're taking actions, but are not actually engaging India. And we see finally now, yesterday, they have responded to what India has been asking for a long time, that under the treaty, there is a mechanism for renegotiating the treaty. True, we may not be able to terminate the treaty, but under customary international law, we will be forced to terminate the treaty because there are change in circumstances. And the change in circumstances are many. There is cross-border terrorism, there is climate change, there is geopolitical issues between the countries, and there are other environmental issues, and of course, the growth in population of both the countries. As the captain pointed out, that earlier we may not have needed the waters for Jammu, but today the population is such that we need the waters. There is climate change. We need access to those waters. So this consistent actions by Pakistan to not allow India to utilize its rights to use the waters led to India repeatedly writing to Pakistan. So it was not a recent decision. This abeyance was coming for a long time. For the past 2 to 3 years, India was actually writing to Pakistan, letting them know that we want to sit across the table and negotiate at a government to government level. Pakistan's response, from what is reported, is that they're willing to have a commissioner to commissioner level discussion. But that was not what was envisaged under the treaty, because the treaty required us a sovereign to sovereign discussion on these issues. And finally, India decided to put it in abeyance. Now, this was, of course, after the cowardly attack against Hindus in Kashmir. This is what it was. Yes, they actually asked each individual their religion and they attacked them. Unarmed civilians were killed in Kashmir. So therefore, India said, now we have consistently been asking you. We had referred to cross-border terrorism, and now we see another act of cross-border terrorism occurring. So therefore, this treaty is put in abeyance. Now, there is a significance to that term, and I would want I'm happy to hear views, because there is a difference in opinion about this, because the word abeyance finds no place in international law. Usually it's either suspension or termination. But however, here we have chosen to use the word abeyance. Some commentators have argued that this is because we are trying to use this as a countermeasure, and we are in fact not suspending. But if you look at the language, even in the letter that was used by the Ministry of Jal Shakti to Pakistan, they've referred to all the grounds that are usually invoked for suspension of a treaty. And all the grounds that are there for termination of treaty equally apply for suspension of a treaty. And we have invoked all of those. So clearly, in my view, we have suspended the treaty, and because both abeyance and suspension ultimately mean a temporary hold or a temporary stop in the functioning of that treaty, and that is what has occurred now. So India has actually taken that action. We can see now finally Pakistan has come forth, and here I would like to just end with 2 points as far as international law is concerned. One is that if you look at the disinformation that Pakistan is doing at every stage, if you look at the statements being made, what the World Bank president said was, I have seen both what the Indian media has said and what the Pakistan media has said. The Indian media pointed out that the World Bank president has in fact held that I have no role, I am a facilitator, and I focused only on that statement. But the Pakistan media focused on another statement, because the World Bank president said there is no suspension under the treaty. So I do not know why the World Bank president decided to start advising on international law. Perhaps he's a scholar, we are unaware. But he opined on whether suspension is possible under the treaty. But in my mind, under customary international law, it's permitted. The fact that it's not said in the treaty is irrelevant, and is perhaps in his wisdom he finds it to be relevant. Similarly, if you see not just that statement, even the letter written by Pakistan Now, the Indian media says they're celebrating, saying that Pakistan has actually written to us and is begging to negotiate. But if you see what the Pakistan media is saying about the same letter, they are saying that they've pointed out the repeated violations by India and that India's act is in violation of international law. So whatever response eventually goes is going to be very important, because opino juris and state action that is taken must be consistent, and hopefully India continues on its path. We are looking at lawfare. This is the reality of today's world. Both Pakistan and India are trying to use international law. We, of course, are invoking the right to self-defense. We are invoking the customary international law to justify the actions we are taking. And clearly, India appears to be following international law, while Pakistan is simply parroting international law for the sake of it. I'll end it here, and perhaps we can open the floor. Thank you.